New York style is a method of building, but it is also the input of all those players. It is also the constant interaction with those instruments. I think every builder has had a D'Angelico in their hand, and if nothing else, in its view, has influenced them. But John, myself, even Jimmy back in the day, Jimmy was rebinding the D'Angelicos and stuff. I mean, Jimmy was right there building them with D'Angelico. But again, I think what makes the New York builders, the four, unique is our interaction with the players using those guitars, our interactions with the actual guitars as well.
Welcome to Life with Strings Attached. I'm your host, Jamie Gale. My guest today is famed Archtop guitar maker Cristian Mirabella. This episode is the result of an impromptu conversation at the end of Cristian's biography episode. After our first recording, Cristian and I kept on talking, and it became clear that there was another thread worth following: the history of the Archtop guitar and how that story moves from Cremona to Michigan, New York, Canada, and beyond. So I asked if we could hit the record button one more time. What you're about to hear is the result of two guitar nerds who just can't stop talking about their shared obsession. I thoroughly enjoyed this conversation with Cristian Mirabella, and I hope that you do as much as I did.
All right, so we already said goodbye. However, we got to talking, and there's a history of how the Archtop goes from Michigan. You mentioned Lloyd Loar, and, well, you didn't mention Orville Gibson, but there's a carved top guitar being made in Michigan, and how does it arrive in New York? You started to tell me, but I thought, let's press record and get this down.
No, so to reiterate what I was just saying to you was D'Angelico is working for his uncle. His uncle has a shop that's building mandolins, banjos, guitars as well. And he starts his job as a kid, and he's there working. Regretfully, his uncle passes. And when his uncle passes, his aunt asks him to run the shop. So he's going to run the shop, but he decides he wants to do something. He sees where the guitar, I think he sees an interest in the guitar, and he wants to make that a focus as opposed to just having this factory of sorts that's making different instruments. He wants to focus in on the guitar, and he wants to make a great guitar. And he takes that L5 from Gibson and he copies it. And when you look at the early D'Angelicos, the very first five, you can tell that he's literally doing it from a visual. He's not really inspecting the internals of the guitar, because the first three D'Angelicos are lateral braced. They're not parallel braced. Again, the X bracing doesn't come until later, but this is 1932. Here he is in 1932. He starts his own shop. Interestingly enough, right out of the gate of starting his own shop, Vincent DeSario is a 12-year-old kid that comes and starts sweeping his floor. So he's working with D'Angelico, and D'Angelico takes that L5 and copies it. And the first couple of guitars, actually the first 70, 80 guitars, I think, actually are basically L5 looking 16-inch body D'Angelicos. It's not until later in 34 that he dramatically alters the shape of the guitar. He alters the shape. It doesn't so much change the size. It's still kind of like a 16. It's kind of like a 16 and a half, but he distinctly changes the upper bout of the guitar. He distinctly gives it the broken scroll headstock. It becomes the D'Angelico. And that's how you get from that, from the Gibson guitar to the D'Angelico guitar. This is also how you define the New York style of making, because also while you now have the Gibson style of guitars and how they're constructed, their neck angles, the way the neck joint is, the dovetail, same thing with the Epiphone. You then have Bob Benedetto. And Bob Benedetto now has a whole different view. He, being a repairer himself, he takes the look at what he saw in the D'Angelicos he was working on, definitely finds a like and confidence in the voicing of the Gibson guitar. So he takes building cues from that. And he now makes his own building style. And quite honestly, it's the Benedetto style of building that becomes a lot of the current builders' manner in which they build.
Yeah.
It actually becomes a big part of the West Coast style of building. But yeah, so you have that Gibson style that is the start of it. Everything. You then have that very distinct New York style, which is the D'Angelico, and how D'Angelico then pushes it. And then you have that Benedetto style. And then Bob, of course, does his book on how to build an Archtop. And again, that comes at a time, as we were talking in the main part of the podcast, when, you know, in the 80s, maybe it was like 91, maybe it wasn't the 80s, maybe it was like 91 and 92, that he writes how to build an Archtop. And for the first time ever, now you have a book. But the book is Bob's manner, you know, the Benedetto way of building. So it opens up a lot of builders' ability based on that. And they use that as their foundation and work off of that. Whereas for us, for the New York builders, we take that D'Angelico style. But yeah, it's literally starting with D'Angelico, like myself, like Jimmy did, going out then on his own from his uncle's shop and saying, you know, I'm going to see what I can do and what my contribution can be, and how he altered it. No, for sure.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting that you start with Loar because, I mean, Orville Gibson starts carving the top. And from my perspective, you know, Orville starts the carved top guitar, the Archtop guitar, and Lloyd Loar basically introduces Cremona. He brings Cremona into what's happening with this guitar. So he removes the oval sound hole and puts in F holes, which, I mean, that's Cremonese through and through, right? And so we have this guitar arriving to America. I don't know what Gibson's history is or how he learns to make mandolins and guitars. I don't know what his background is. A lot of what was coming to America that was guitar making was Germanic, you know, via, well, Stauffer, Stromberg, you know, all these are German companies, Martin, or Germanic, I should say, because Stauffer is technically Viennese, and whereas Martin is Germany. And I don't even know that those countries existed as we understand them today back in that day. But nonetheless, there's this melding pot that happens in America with many things, and Loar's contribution to an already existing Archtop and mandolin company is to bring it back to Cremona. From my perspective, what do you think of that?
Well, I agree, and I think maybe why I don't immediately go to Orville Gibson, because again, rightly so, the style the original L4s were Orville Archtop guitars. I think I start with Lloyd Loar because not only does he bring the violin family of instrument to the guitar, but he carves the plates and the manner in which he carves the plates. So again, as we were discussing in earlier, you know, you can take once you bring it to a further point, you now have greater ability. And that, I think, is while Lloyd Loar clearly redefines the Archtop guitar by giving it the F holes. More notably, he gives it a greater voice, because when you look at Orville Gibson Archtop instruments, they're very thick. Now, that's not to say that they're made incorrectly. And while I would dare say I feel they're done in that manner more for the aesthetics, in a sense. Again, you look at some of the harp guitars, they're strikingly gorgeous, but they're also at points almost a half-inch thick.
Yeah, they're clumsy.
You know, so what they've, you know, they are contributing a voice. So to say that they're made incorrectly wouldn't be fair. But it's Lloyd Loar that says, okay, if we not only take the Cremona method of let's put these F holes, but the graduation of the top, going from the center where it's a bit thicker, flaring out to a thinner, making it more like a speaker cone. So this thing is going to move. I don't think Orville's intention was, how can I most efficiently move this top wood to activate the back? Whereas I do think Lloyd Loar was doing that. He was saying, okay, I have this great idea. He's given me this great premise to work on. But if I make this thing more efficient, it's going to make 4 times the volume, and I can do it in a smaller size, because that's why the L5 actually becomes the 16-inch. Because once you reduce the plate and you have the ability and movement of that top, that guitar is, as soon as the guitar is struck by that first note, the top is activated. Now, as the player is playing, it's staying moving. So its voice now is building as the instrument has all its piece in a state of flux and movement. That voice is clearly being pushed. So I think that's why I always say from Loar, because I think Loar gives us the guitar that is still a viable, very mainstream used guitar. You can play a Lloyd Loar L5. There are guys that prefer the smaller body 16-inch L5 over the D'Angelico, a 17 or 18-inch guitar. Respectfully, all the instruments are wonderful. There's not that, no one's grabbing the Stylo, even though it's beautiful looking, and going, this is going to be my main guitar. They may find songs and voicings that it's needed for, but it doesn't tend to be a mainstay voice, because I don't think it has the range that the Loar does, that definitely the D'Angelicos have, that humbly I will say the Mirabella will give the player. So I think that's why,
No, I get it.
you,
We always have to choose a starting point too. When we're talking about the history of guitar,
but I think it's
I can
fair
say
what you're
that
saying, Jamie,
that
as far as this true start is Loar, is Orville Gibson.
yeah, and I mean there might be some random guitar makers who made carved top guitars in Vienna or Cremona or somewhere at some point in time. I don't really know. I did just see a collection of, I'm going to say 50 to 60 early guitar iterations, sort of pre-Torres, pre-Stauffer. And there was a Torres in the collection, a Stauffer also in the Civic Museum in Cremona. It's on display right now. There's, for about 5 years, a really interesting collection of guitars. But most of them are not standardized like Torres kind of standardized the guitar in the way that we currently play it, with the 6 strings tuned the way they are and such, the approximate shape. But there's always going to be someone to say, no, the guitar came from, well, we have to choose a point. And so you're choosing a point to talk about it as sort of Lloyd Loar. I'm sort of trying to understand, to your point, there's a sensitivity there. We could talk about, Benz making the first production cars. Does the car start there, or does the car start where the average person gets it with the Model T, or is it not a real car until Lorenzo Ferrari gets involved? You can choose.
Right. No, absolutely. And that's why I think actually in the conversation, I would have to say you're correct in saying that Orville Gibson would probably be the start of the Archtop, where Loar, if I modify my response to say Loar is the catalyst that puts it in motion to become a main instrument. Had, I think, it stayed, in the realm of what Orville had done, it would be a wonderful instrument, but I don't think it would become the voice that it is today, where you have the guitar, and you don't need anything else. I mean, while of course it's wonderful, play with a full band, play with a full orchestra, you can have a player, and many of the greats, Joe Pass, Jim Hall, would do it, a player in the guitar, and don't need anything else. And I think in order to have that, Loar gives you the foundation of that, because it's that changing, that looking at the violin instruments and going, okay, their tops are tremendously thinner than what we're doing. This thing is actually graduated with a recurve. There's a point that they're driving the sound. They're not just allowing the sound of what our construction has made to be the voice of the instrument. They're actually making the construction a viable, active contribution to the voice. And in doing so, that's manipulating how thick it is and stuff like that. And from that, you get all that we do today.
As a guitar builder and a player, you have a sense for when something's working right. That's why so many of the world's best trust D'Addario. Unmatched tone, perfect intonation, and strings made to the tightest tolerances in the industry. That reputation is no accident. It's the result of 400 years of being obsessed with quality and innovation. D'Addario, when you know, you know.
Great. I want to ask one more question along the trajectory of the Archtop guitar a little bit here, because I get why you're a New York Archtop guy. You're in New York. You're out on the island, at least like many of them have been. You know, D'Angelico was in Manhattan, but DeQuisto ended up out there, and Monteleone's out there, and you're out there on Long Island. And now Linda Manzer came and studied with Jimmy. She's actually still making Archtop guitars. Of you, John, and Linda, she's the only one who actually studied with him, like worked with him in his workshop and apprenticed under him for a relatively short period, but nonetheless, an intentional, I'm coming to New York to learn this from you directly, which neither you or John actually did, right? And I'm walking on eggshells here because I don't want to say this wrong, because I'm not trying to cause any shit in any way. I'm just trying to understand how the piece fits in, because there's not somebody in New York who studied with Jimmy where it continues in New York, right? But there's somebody up in Canada who studied with Jimmy that carries on. And do you see Linda as a part of carrying on the New York tradition? Or is it something different, like Benedetto, where they took the guitar and changed it and a new school came out of it?
No. So for me, I truly do see Linda as part of the New York thing. I do respectfully think, Linda came from her from her time in Larrivee.
Yeah.
So I think when you look at Linda's guitars, you clearly see a New York style towards her building of her archtops. But her archtops are also influenced by all her flat top making. So that's not to say, but yeah, she definitely, I think she's the only one. It's like if Linda lived in New York, she'd be in New York. So she just went back home to Canada. So, but the information that she had, her style is a New York style. I think, as far as being, and again, humbly being attached to the original four, which a couple of the guys use the term, it's just because we've all had, with the exception of knowing D'Angelico directly, I've had that interaction with all four. I've had interaction with the four, and the two led up to the other two. Whereas I think that's what makes the New York builders, the four, unique to themselves. But yeah, I think Linda clearly is part of that New York style, in that, she had what she had learned. And I think even what she experimented with herself with the flat top, she then comes to Jimmy. And I think she told me the story of, she actually was building her own instrument while in Jimmy's shop. And then Jimmy, I guess, was showing her, you should do it this way, you should do it that way. But clearly, when you look at one of her instruments today, you see those cues, you see that styling. And I think it makes again, I think it makes a wonderful instrument. Linda makes, an incredible guitar, and, she's just an absolutely amazing and wonderful person. So.
Yeah, there's something about culture, though, that is hard to replace. And I think that's maybe a bit of what you're alluding to is, Mike Tobias said this to me years ago when I was first getting to know him. And we talked about, he asked me where I thought who was making some of the best instruments. And I named a number of European instrument makers at the time. And Mike's perspective wasn't that they weren't making good instruments. It's always been harder for them because they haven't had the plethora of musicianship, of American style musicianship, right? So when you export a music to somewhere else, or export a culture to somewhere else, it becomes something different. Like, oh, here, I'm going to get in shit for saying this. It's like how much New Yorkers love the New York slice. It is not an Italian pizza. It's a New York pizza. Right? But I'm sitting in Italy right now. I had a pizza last night. It is nothing like a New York slice. They've become something else. And so, but there's something with being in the culture, where, like Mike alluded to, Mike had all of these incredible bass players around New York that he got to sort of dial in his instruments with. And you and John, Jimmy, Other John, all of you were right there with all of the Archtop players. That there is just not that culture in Toronto or Almont, where she's
And
building today.
I think, Jamie, that might be actually a very fair assessment to say, with all respect, that makes us in New York have that something a little bit different in that, yes, our guitars are influenced by all the players here in New York, and you have that abundance around you influencing you. So the New York style is a method of building, but it is also the input of all those players. It is also the constant interaction with those instruments. I think every builder has had, hopefully, thankfully, a D'Angelico in their hand, and if nothing else, in its view, has influenced them. But John, myself, even Jimmy back in the day, Jimmy was rebinding the D'Angelicos and stuff. I mean, Jimmy was right there building them with D'Angelico. But again, I think what makes the New York builders, the four, unique is our interaction with the players using those guitars, our interactions with the actual guitars as well. I've had the pleasure of, actually, it's an unfortunate pleasure in a sense. I think I've rebound almost half of Jimmy's guitars at this point. Jimmy made 360 something Archtop guitars. He made the laminate boxes as well, but in what's going to be, as you said, a 30-year period. And that's one of the things I started out with. We typically have between 10 to 12 guitars in the shop at any given point that are getting rebound. So that influence, that input, I think is unique, definitely, as you said, is unique to the New York thing. And it kind of defines itself, just as you said, where, the Italian pizza might be the real pizza, but that New York slice is clearly the New York slice. And you can have someone learn how to do the New York slice and go back to Italy. It's not going to be that New York slice because it's not in New York. And there probably is something to that for sure.
Yeah. It's funny that you chose to turn that around on me to say, you can't make a New York slice in Italy. I'm like, who's fucking trying?
Well, that's the point. That's the point, is that, right, in Italy, I'm sure the slice, probably from my perspective, would be even better. But, would the critic then go, oh, that's a New York slice? Probably not.
No. So, all right, let's flip this around, because there's sort of conservation and there's liberation, right? And so we go from nothing changing to be total conservation to total liberation is chaos and unrecognizable, right? They've been getting a little too theoretical, but take the Archtop maker who's learned with Jimmy DeQuisto and take them out of New York, and maybe they get to untether themselves from history and create something new. Linda's, and I'm not trying to make a fight here in any way, but Linda has actually made a career with some very experimental musicians. People like Pat Metheny are not trying to sound like Jim Hall, right? Like,
absolutely.
And, I don't know how many guitars she's made for Metheny. I think 40, 50 instruments at this point.
A lot.
A lot.
Right.
You paid for her house. But Linda's become one of those guitar makers where if you want something different, she's one of the people on the list where you go to that person to get something different. And so, there's always this, I think about this a lot because cultures of music have the same issue. So cultures of music, you don't get petri dishes like we once did that were limited because of how far someone would travel or how far the radio transmission would go. When, as a Canadian, when I used to go to guitar shops anywhere near the American border, they would bring up what they grew up on with Canadian content because they were close enough. They would hear our music in our TV stations. And then we had a comedy show, SCTV, which actually, it kind of birthed Saturday Night Live, came out of Toronto with SCTV. A lot of those first casts came out of Toronto and SCTV. But if you grew up in Detroit, you got Canadian TV. So everybody does impressions of Canadian comedians like Dan Aykroyd and John Candy and Martin Short and Rick Moranis, all these people that came out of SCTV. And so you were influenced by that culture, but you didn't get to hear the radio station from Memphis, and you didn't get to hear the radio station from Bakersville, and so you didn't hear that music, and those cultures sort of blew up,
Right.
and New York had a specific music culture, but when you are away from it, you can also synthesize and create something different as well. And so there is a pressure within New York. New York is the only place that one of two places that I go to with Archtops, and the other place isn't a city, it's a store where they'll tell me whether it Archtops or not. In New York, it's like, if it doesn't do this D'Angelico thing, you're not making a fucking Archtop. The only other place that happens is when I go to see George Gruen, and George will tell me this. George will also tell me this.
Right.
They don't know how to build an Archtop,
Right.
Whereas I go to other cities, and frankly, they're freed from the tradition, so the Archtop can become something else. And that's where someone like a Ken Parker, or frankly, even Megan Wells, or even Monteleone has said to me, I don't want people to call it a jazz box, because I think you can do more on this than
definitely
jazz,
don't definitely don't want them to be limited to a type of music. I think it's one of those things where you can jokingly say, when your parents would say to you, be careful of the friends you choose, because your friends will influence you. So as you say, with different builders, you can take the information. Linda goes to Canada and meets up with Matheny, Julian, and makes these instruments and stuff. I think that's the beauty actually of it, in that the people you build for will kind of influence you, and the people that Linda was working with were pushing the envelope of what else can you do? And that's what she was. So I think it's a little bit, I mean, again, I think we all want different things. We all want to push that envelope, but how we want to push that envelope, how do we want to work beyond, again, Linda pushes the envelope to the point of the Picasso guitar, and who would have thought that up? What an amazing instrument. It's far removed from the reality of what an instrument was before it.
Right.
So it depends on what you want to do and what you're hoping for. For me, again, it was, I fell in love with that D'Angelico voice. I just wanted the guitar to have, as I heard all these different players, and like you're saying, not just jazz players. What happens if a classical? So Fabio Martino is one of the players that plays a Mirabella guitar. He's not a jazz player. What happens when he plays the Mirabella guitar? Thankfully, something I would never perceive as a possibility for the guitar, because the voice is there to allow him to do his expression based off of classical music, based on, all the different things he's doing. Rocco Jacca, again, who was traditionally jazz trained musician, but also now does his own. I think Rocco has like 4 different bands of his own modern music and stuff. Pushing, I mean, he uses a pet. So he came for a concert. It was lovely that he came, played a concert here on the island for us. He has a pedal board. I think of pedal boards, I think of John Frusciante, and players like that who I love their tone, but I'm thinking of Stratocasters and stuff like that. Here's a guy with an Archtop acoustic Mirabella with a floating pickup on it, and he's literally got a pedal board that has 7 or 8 pedals on it, and expressing himself, and yet again, taking that guitar and making voices with it that me as the builder want him to have the ability to have, but I'm not the player he is, so I don't know that he can pull that out. So yeah, I think, and I think that's what makes it wonderful. I mean, Megan Wells, is a wonderful friend. We used to talk vintage guitars and D'Angelicos and stuff like that, and she's now found this wonderful niche of where I think a lot of her guitars are a smaller body size, and that's where she finds her voice, and that's how she feels, okay, I can really express myself with this. I think that's what makes it really cool as far as, each of the different builders. You look at the guitar and you go, oh, Megan's, oh, Linda's,
Hmm.
John's, mine,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
also too, in this now sea of guitars where back in the day we didn't have much, you still look at that D'Angelico and from across the room you go D'Angelico. You see Jimmy's guitar, it's the Acquisto. And I
yeah.
think that's something we're all looking for, our own unique identity for sure.
Cedar Creek Custom Case Shop is your premier fretted instrument custom case maker, and we invite you to create a musical instrument case unlike any other, one that's unique to you. Every Cedar Creek custom case is hand-built by highly skilled craftspeople using only select woods, Providence Forge hardware, and premium instrument-friendly materials. At Cedar Creek Custom Case Shop, we are dedicated to helping you design the case of your dreams. Find out more at cedarcreekcases.com.
Yeah. Yeah, it's hard to do. It's the Archtop is a so when we have this conservation juxtaposed against chaos, when you have a serious body of work that's been developed, a lot of great songs, a lot of great music around a particular instrument or instrumentation, that's where we get this idea of, oh, this Archtop's or doesn't Archtop. It's because it's supposed to perform and sound like the things we hear. And I'm not a huge, I don't have a big vocabulary of jazz songs in my head. So honestly, I think of it's probably an awful reference, but I think of the opening to Body and Soul when I think about the sound of an Archtop. It's just that sort of working through the chord is iconic Archtop sound to me.
Right.
And if it doesn't do that, it can't reenact those moments of history. And so once you develop a big enough songbook and a culture around it, then it's kind of going to church. When you go to a particular church, there's a particular book of songs you sing and the particular set of instruments around it, and you reenact the hero with that at a certain point. But then there's times where it breaks out, and there are moments where it breaks out, and we'll see what happens ultimately with the Archtop. I think that there are possibilities outside of it, but nobody's established a really big body of work. There's been, there's moments like Maybelle Carter, where it's not jazz music, but there's not been enough like a whole new genre of music or a whole bunch of people are all of a sudden listen to something that's played on those traditional Archtops. And so it's currently in a particular period, mostly within the minds of people. And then we get to things where you push quite outside of it. You make a synthesis like a Tim Bram guitar, which looks like a Telecaster, but is carved Archtop guitar. I mean, he's legitimately making Archtop guitars, but it does not do that Archtop thing. It absolutely does not do that Archtop thing. But if you're a guitar player who grew up playing flat tops or electric guitars, and you think you want to experience some of that Archtop thing, you'll be much more comfortable with his guitar than you will be by getting a vintage Stromberg, which...
Right. But also,
which feels like you're playing a cello.
But also to the point is and I'm seeing a lot of this is, again, from the era we grew up, you have all the rock and roll heavy metal speed metal guys.
Yeah.
That as they're getting older, they're opening their view as to what music they're interested in. And it may be that Stratocaster got them to that Archtop Telecaster style guitar that gets them to the Stromberg or gets them to the Mirabella, because, as you experiment and you say, okay, well, because again, I saw that D'Angelico at 12. Before that, if it wasn't a Stratocaster or a Les Paul, it wasn't that cool. So I think that becomes part of it. And I think that's one of the things that's actually wonderful about today is that no one's in a box. No one's like, oh, you have to be a jazz guitar player. You're a jazz guitar player. Oh, you have to be a blues guitar player. You have to, a wonderful player that I really, really like is Marcus King. So Marcus King is this wonderful blues player, and you listen to him play and he's incorporating jazz. There's not anything this kid, and I say that respectfully, he's younger than me, so he's a kid.
Yeah.
But there's not anything that he's not putting into his music. And he goes from all out just rock and roll Southern type blues stuff to he's got some songs that archtop jazz like type of tunes. There's one video he's playing a D'Angelico. It's I think it's a new D'Angelico. It's not a vintage one, but he's using the D'Angelico. So I think, thankfully, in today's world, a lot of the players, and I think that's actually a byproduct, to be honest with you, a byproduct of the collectible market, in that some of the guitars got so expensive that younger players couldn't really even perceive them, that the whole "I got to have that guitar" wasn't as important to them at the beginning. It's just, give me a good guitar. So their mindset of, "Oh, I have to have this guitar for this," doesn't really apply. They're just looking for the cool guitar, and I think that keeps them open to, "Oh wow, oh, I saw that that J45. Wow, that might work. Oh, I just saw the Epiphone Emperor. Oh, that might work." And they're not limiting themselves to say, "Oh, I got to stay within this framework of these are the guitars that I think will work." So I think, thankfully, you're seeing more players use more things. I think, thankfully, you see, again, you mentioned Adam Miller, phenomenal player, and Adam will, sit, and Adam, again, the wonderful player is, he plays him. When you hear him, it's distinctly him.
Yeah.
But he'll do it on a Parker guitar. He thankfully has played a Mirabella guitar, and you go, wow. And again, is it what the Mirabella was meant to be played for? Absolutely, because Adam's playing at that moment. If I had the pleasure that Jim Hall would be able to play the guitar, it would sound like Jim Hall or Wes Montgomery, or name the Tal Farlow, or Jimmy Rainey, or any of one of the greats and stuff like that. But equally so, if I had the pleasure and joy of Jimmy Page playing a Mirabella guitar, it would be what Jimmy Page would need in that moment. So I think, I think that there's a wonderful openness to the players today as to what they can.
So do you see a connection between the New York Archtop and the Parker Archtop?
That's an interesting one. And to be respectful, I think the Parker Archtop, one of the key aspects of what makes a New York Archtop a New York Archtop, you can even hear Jimmy talk about it if you've ever watched the movie, New Yorker Classic, I think it's called. And it's two young filmmakers in 1982, I think, or 81, filming Jimmy. Oh, actually, I think it's called the New Yorker Special, is the video. And one of the things Jimmy talks about is the dovetail. And it is a key thing, how that dovetail locks into the guitar, and how the extension locks in over is very unique on a New York guitar as opposed to the Gibson, and more notably how Bob Benedetto introduced it in his book, and how a lot of the modern makers build their instrument following Bob's method. So because of that neck joint and the relationship, as Jimmy said, Jimmy wants a beautiful story. Jimmy had a guitar that was in the white. It had no finish on it yet, had no parts on it. And again, me, a young kid in the shop, I would always try to be very quiet. So he would let me walk around and check out things. So I would, and he would always very kindly make a point to notice me, which again, all the guys wonderfully did. I never felt like the kid in the shop, although I clearly knew I was. They never pointed that out, like, "Oh, you're the kid that doesn't know anything." They were always very kind. I felt very equal, although I knew I was around these amazing and great people. But Jimmy takes a glance at me. He takes the guitar, he drops it on the bench on its bottom edge. So it stands up on the bench by itself, and he lets go because it has no end pin, it has no tailpiece. So the guitar literally balances and he steps away from it. Like he literally just plunks it down with a thunk and doesn't wait with his hand to see if it's going to stay there. He literally just lets go, and he says to me, he goes, "Chris, that's how you know it's going to be a good guitar. Everything's balanced. Everything's working together." And that, again, that's one of the fundamentals of the New York style of building right there, is That dovetail locks the neck in, and then the neck is as much as a vocal point as the body is. They're working in unison together. It's one piece. Respectfully, not knowing all the details of how Ken, although I have to say I had the pleasure, Ken was a guy, came regularly. My daughter, who's now 19 years old, he used to come with me to drop off my daughter at nursery school, because his dad actually lived in Babylon here on the island. So he'd come visit his dad. He'd call me up and say, "Hey, Chris, I'm going to come by," and we'd talk guitars and stuff like that. But his guitar has a gearing mechanism, I believe, inside the neck. So you don't have to adjust the bridge. You actually can adjust the neck by a key in the back. An Allen key in the back allows the neck to move to change your action.
Yeah.
Again, is that wrong? I wouldn't say that's wrong, in that that's what Ken perceived the voicing of his instrument, and that neck joint, contributes to that. But it is clearly a different method and an association from what the New York style. So it's kind of like, does it have, is there a connection to the Parker, to the New York style of guitar? In construction, I'd say absolutely not, respectfully. But in the desire for a quality instrument, Ken clearly was doing that, trying to make a wonderful and amazing instrument. Well, then, yeah, in that there is.
Yeah. Yeah. The adjustable neck is actually comes from Vienna, I think, originally. So Martin made adjustable necks until he came to New York. When he was in New York, he was still making them. I think he switched over to a dovetail exclusively in Pennsylvania. I think you have to double check on that, on the history. Sorry to all you Martin heads out there who are going to tell me I got it wrong. But the point is, Stouffer absolutely made an adjustable neck, and Martin removes it at a certain point in time. And it's one of the distinctions, because Martin left Germany because the viol instrument makers were trying to claim that a cabinet maker wasn't allowed to make a guitar. But they didn't take the guitar seriously. They didn't think it was a real instrument, the violin makers. But they were starting to sell guitars. And it was the cabinet makers who made the guitars, because they were furniture, not instruments. And real people made those. And so the dovetail is a furniture making joint. It is not a traditional instrument maker joint. Torres didn't do it. It's a Spanish heel on those. Stouffer didn't do it. It's cabinet makers who brought in the dovetail. That doesn't diminish it. I only mean there's a certain perception today where people think, oh, the dovetail is the most traditional joint. It is absolutely not the most traditional joint. It came from making cabinets. It didn't come from making violins or flamenco guitars or anything of the sort. And but it becomes an integral part, you say, for the New York way. And so what's different about the construction of the dovetail that happens in New York versus, say, a normal, like a Martin dovetail? What's happening that's different there?
Well, so
I mean, I know you've got an elevated neck in the first place, but still, we're talking about a V-cut joint, a dovetail, effectively. So what's different about it?
Right. So the Martin dovetail, as well as most Archtop dovetails, is much shallower than the New York style dovetail. It's a much bigger. Again, the concentration of the wood that's within the body is more locked in. There's more locked in. Equally so, that extension that we're talking about.
You mean there's more mass? There's a larger block inside.
The block is as well as large, as well as the dimensions of the dovetail is bigger.
Oh, it's like the New York Rat. They're just bigger there.
Yeah, just bigger. Well, New York, you're right. Make it bigger. It's kind of like the Texas thing. Bigger in Texas. But here we are in New York. But it's kind of that, in that you want the neck to be more interactive to the body. So its contribution as the string vibrates is being moved amongst the entire instrument. That extension equally so, whereas most people, and even Gibson, will just tap a piece onto the end. It's butt glued to the end of the neck. The D'Angelico, the New York style, is in itself as well dovetailed into the neck. And it's just these interactionary locks that allow everything to resonate better as a whole. It also provides a better balance because in moving the dovetail of the extension over the other dovetail, you're placing an even balance. So that instrument does, again, now stand on its own. So when the player has it in his hands, he's not holding the instrument up. The instrument will sit in position properly and he can let go. So there's never a weight on it. He's not fatiguing his hand as he's playing because he's not holding up the instrument as well as playing. But I think that's it, in reference to, the construction of the Spanish guitars, their necks entered into their body. So the wantingness to get that neck to be an integral piece of the body, to my understanding, was still making it so that it was, it was working with the body.
Yeah, there is no neck block in a Spanish heel.
Right.
It is the neck, and they build the sides into slots on the neck. Yeah. Whereas, so there's no dovetail because it's not two blocks joined together. It's one whole piece.
Right.
But
the want to make sure that the body is interacting with the neck is there.
Yeah.
So that they're making the sides literally connect into what is the neck, and then they're just sloping down that back portion. Instead of having that straight block, they have that portion that basically just, and again, I think by design, forces all the resonancy of whatever the neck is doing into the back of the guitar, which as well is what the top is doing. So the top is resonating, it's bringing it down into the sides, motivating the back for movement, but also too, in the style and design of that neck, the neck is equally doing the same. In a simpler, more cabinet-like making manner, that dovetail in the D'Angelico is doing the same. And they're increasing the mass of it because the shallowness of it, of other instruments, I think D'Angelico found it's not contributing enough. I need to increase. If you look at the early D'Angelicos, the ones that are modeled after the L5s, they have shallower dovetails. In fact, the first D'Angelico, the very first D'Angelico, which I thankfully had the pleasure of restoring, doesn't have a dovetail at all. Its neck is set in like a violin. So it's just a little further extension of the neck, and it just falls into that slot, and it's in a spruce block.
Wow.
And again, that guitar, very interesting in that it's uniquely voiced. But I'll tell you, Jamie, and again, it's one of those things where you say a Mirabella is a Mirabella, the Gibson is the Gibson. That very first D'Angelico being nowhere near what D'Angelico then created and made the foundation of the New York style of Archtop, still has the voice of the New York style of Archtop. So again, I think it's, going back to the little romanticness of it, the desire, the want, the feeling, putting your heart and soul into the instrument. In that first guitar, even though it's not constructed accurately in the quote unquote New York style, because it is in fact a D'Angelico made by D'Angelico's hands, it still has that voice in it. It's not as predominant as a 59 D'Angelico. It doesn't have all the ability that a 59 or 60D or whatever D'Angelico has. But when you listen to a chord on that very first guitar, it's not an L5 and it's not an Epiphone. It is distinctly the D'Angelico sound.
This space is normally reserved for brands who make stories like this possible, like the Dario and the Cedar Creek Custom Case Shop. If your company belongs in this conversation, let's talk. We partner with brands who value craft, culture, and the quiet power of a well-placed idea.
All right, since you're helping me with the history of Archtop here, I appreciate it. You mentioned Epiphone a number of times, and, in the modern sense, Epiphone is a cheap Gibson, and that's probably makes some people want to cry a little bit, but...
Yeah, say it for what it was, absolutely.
Do you know enough about them to straighten that out? What is the... I mean, they were also a New York Archtop maker, weren't they?
They were New York Archtop maker. Yeah. They actually were one of the top Archtop makers, quite honestly. Again, the Epiphones, the Broadways, the Triumphs, the Deluxes, and of course, if you could have it, the Emperor, were amazing guitars and major guitars, and a lot of the top players use them. Many a times you'll see the Epiphone Emperor, with notable guys and notable players. They also had some amazing electrics. They had the Epiphone Emperor Zephyr, which actually was one of the first like 3 pickup push button, Archtop guitars, and so they were making incredible instruments for their time. I think they just were a smaller company, and as Gibson, thankfully, having Loar, and then even the later L5s, when they make the 17-inch L5, that's a great guitar. I mean, that guitar defined so much music, and then when they make the electric L5, the electric L5 really defines, that in the 175, which is a laminate guitar, but still that laminate guitar becomes the voice of so many of the greatest players.
Yeah.
I don't, I think it kind of like Stromberg. Stromberg, an amazing guitar, but Stromberg struggled to compete with the ability of Gibson. I think the numbers that Gibson could just, but again, it was quality and an amazing guitar. I mean, again, thankfully, I had the pleasure of doing the restoration at Ronnie's shop on Hank Garland Stromberg, which was actually the prototype for the Birdland. So the Hank Garland Stromberg predates the Birdland as a thin-bodied archtop, and an amazing guitar. An absolutely amazing guitar. But I think, it was Epiphone falls into the same category of they couldn't compete with Gibson, so they did the next best thing I guess they could in their situation was they became part of Gibson. Gibson buys them, and Gibson in the 60s basically turns Epiphone into their student model guitars. But again, it's still all American made. So the Epiphone and the models basically rival Gibson. So you could have your Epiphone Rivera, which was the guitar John Lennon had in Blonde, or you could have your Gibson 330. It was the same guitar. It just had a different headstock, but the Epiphone was the slightly lesser model than the Gibson model. And then I think that's what you then see today is because even in the 60s, 70s, it gets the allure of being the student model. When it then gets sold off again, it's just simply perceived as a student model. So having it made overseas, is a no-brainer. Let's do that because we just want to be able to offer it to students at an affordable price. So that's unfortunately what ends up happening to it. But there's a time where they're great,
This period, the influence of the Archtop carries on in sort of these renderings of the icon because, when the electric guitar hits the solid body electric guitar, a lot of people don't take them seriously because they don't look like a real guitar. They don't look like a flat top or an Archtop, right? And so, we've got this sort of move into the Les Paul, which doesn't go off very well. And so then they kind of say, well, we'll make something between it. And they make the 335 and the Birdland and these sort of guitars a little bit bigger, a little bit hollow, but not totally, but the Les Paul is really a rendering of a 175. It is an Archtop guitar made tiny and solid, right? Which is not a great way to make an instrument. That's why it's so horribly balanced, and there's a lot of real issues. Now, a lot of great music's been made on it, and a lot of people love them. But if you're to try and design a guitar like that today in a design school, you'd fail, because it gets it wrong in so many ways. But they can't break themselves from the icon of the Archtop, and that's what we see in the Les Paul. Is them chained to the tradition of that shape, the carved top, the influence of Cremona, the varnish finishes, the transparent finishes are all looking very natural. The shape of the Archtop, the bridge, the tailpiece, it's all kind of the early ones anyways, and a lot of them still had trapezes on them. They're still firmly attached to the Archtop guitar. And so although people don't view the Les Paul as an Archtop guitar, it is absolutely from the lineage.
Definitely from the lineage, and to that point, Jamie, and guitars I've been working with as of lately, Gibson tries once. Actually, you have the Fender Stratocaster, and the Fender Stratocaster actually puts out an ad and in their ad to introduce the Stratocaster is not your dad's guitar. I think the ad goes, and that's their response to here's our guitar. And they're of course making the the insinuation that your Gibson is outdated, and for your dad you should be playing a Stratocaster if you're a young player. Gibson's response to that is kind of the L5, although it is kind of the Les Paul, although the Les Paul was really the answer to the Telecaster type thing. Their answer to the Stratocaster and this Not Your Father's guitar is actually the Flying V, the Explorer, and the Modern, which completely get looked at as, what the hell are you doing?
Yeah.
And nobody likes them. And in today's world, now, and again, as you say, from a design standpoint, you take the Flying V, this thing doesn't balance. This thing doesn't. It's none of those things. But then you take a guy like Albert King, and you give him a Carina Flying V, and it's amazing. It's amazing. And you find out later, again, even myself, being a guy that was into Strats and Les Pauls, I totally dismissed the Vs and the Explorers. Recently working with an original Explorer, found out it's actually an incredible jazz guitar. You put that thing in a neck pickup and you forget the fact that it's an Explorer with this hockey stick headstock and everything, and you just play it, and all of a sudden, it does all the Archtop, well, the quote unquote electric Archtop, but it does the jazz tones beautifully. So yeah, you have, again, I think it comes back to what we were saying about what the players can see within the instrument and what, so you can take a guy that has no knowledge of jazz and he might find a home on an Archtop guitar because he's just not looking at it, saying to himself, oh, I have to play jazz. Like when I was a kid, and I mentioned to you, I fell in love with the guitar first, but then started taking jazz lessons because I felt I should learn how to play jazz on the guitar. I didn't have the mindset that maybe I should have to say, I just need to play what I want on it. I don't have to play the jazz on it,
Yeah.
So definitely.
I experience that all the time on tour with Boutique Guitar Showcase, and I've developed my career on unusual instruments, and whenever you put something like that in someone's hands, there's always that, like, for the first 5 minutes, they try and play what they think they're supposed to play on the guitar. And then they really get to know it once they forget what they think they're supposed to do and just start playing. And I think that I would encourage a lot of people to try that with an Archtop guitar. It's, I've only been around your guitars at shows. I've never actually been in a quiet environment to try your guitar. I did have a chance to play John Monteleone's guitars at his place last year. We did the interview in person when I was there doing an event. And I tell you that they are voiced in a way where there is much more to them than I thought there was. They don't sound like an old Archtop. And Adam Miller told me the same thing about yours. I said, what is about this? He's like, they're just a great guitar, man. Stop thinking about it. Stop overthinking it.
Very kind. No, that's wonderful and kind of him to say. But yeah, that's, that is what you're, and having seen some of the guitars that you have in your show, I think that's what's wonderful about them. Is I think those guitars are great in that, some of them push the mindset. So, I mean, they're so far removed that there's one of the ones that it's just literally beautiful wood cylinders. Like, I forget the maker that does that.
That's Teufel Birdfish. Yeah.
Very beautiful in that it's beautifully modernistic. And again, what should you play on that? It kind of forces the player to not have an opinion. Whereas, with some of the arch tops, with some of the flat tops, you may hand that to someone and say, don't think about what you should play. Just play what you want to play. It's nice that some of those guitars are just, I don't know what to play on this. So then just have at it, and see where you go. Again, that's definitely what you want to, what you want to do. So again, but like you mentioned with the Les Pauls, that it, in essence is a little Archtop guitar. Thankfully, the guys didn't really perceive it as such. And then you have Jimmy Page and Led Zeppelin and, all the guys that take that Les Paul and make it what it is and make the 59 verse as desirable as it is. And again, guys like Albert King, playing that Flying V, you know, and making it and saying, wow, okay, I would never have thought of that guitar as a blues guitar. You know,
Mhm.
I don't even know what to think of that thing. You know, again, just, you know, again, if in the 90s, in the 80s and 90s, it ended up being a wonderful thing because when the hard rock, heavy metal stuff came out, those guitars and then the BC Riches that came out, you know,
Yeah.
the BC Riches were all the wacky shapes and stuff like that. Then they had the aesthetic that they wanted, so the V's became popular. But yeah, again, how depending on how the player chooses to use it, you know, it could be good for anything.
Yeah, it's one of my favorite things about the guitars. You know, the guitar is a people's instrument. The people are constantly changing, and the guitar is the only instrument that I'm aware of that constantly evolves. And, you know, we always get these people like proclaiming that the guitar is dead, that it stopped evolving, that the best thing we ever did was back in this date, and nothing's new. It's like, open your eyes, man. Look somewhere
Hmm.
else, because the only unreasonable conclusion is that the guitar has stopped evolving. Because from 1850 to the first 100 years, there's like 10 or 12 iterations we still make today, and it continues to change even now. Just if you're not looking in the right spot, I guess you don't see it. But the guitar is
Absolutely.
maybe the piano's a close one. The piano's still locked into a particular form for the most part. The guitar has a great deal of variation in it, and so
No, I tell you, Jamie, I agree with that comment immensely because, and that's why I think the art, the guitar itself is the greatest instrument in that its ability to do anything. I mean, I love violin music.
mhm,
I mean, I love piano music as well, but I love the voice of a violin. And Hilary Hahn, amazing player, and you know, again, Perlman. You know, you can talk about the greats, you know, Heifetz and all those, but it's just an amazing voice, but to me, there is I don't wanna say a limitation, but there seems to be, like, something to the guitar just there is nothing I don't think you can do with it. And then again, as you said, you see guys use, vintage instruments for different things, and as you're saying, if you're not looking at you can see massive innovation from Lloyd Loar's L5 to D'Angelico's guitar.
mhm,
There's massive in it, even though within the structure of itself, you would think they're the same, it's just an archtop. But no, there's actually a tremendous amount more ability in my perception that the D'Angelico has than where it started with the L5. And then you get the guys that are pushing that to where we say we're now, you know, you have builders that are taking the Stratocaster shape, small body guitars, and making the archtop smaller. You
mhm.
know, it's just yeah. Again, if you can find a meaningful voice as a builder within it, and then you can find a player that goes, yeah, that works for me. You know, now you have something. Then it becomes just ability of how many players do need it. You know, becomes how popular it becomes. But
Yeah.
again, if you satisfied the one you made it for, you're winning. You know, you're getting where you need to be.
Yeah, and who knows what the future has to say, you know, because we talk about Stradivari and Amati and these great violin makers, and they were incredible makers, but none of their violins are the way they made them. They had them with
Very
gut
true.
strings. They didn't have
Right?
them with the strings that we have today, and they're a different scale length. They've all been modified. Every single one of them. We don't play in that tuning anymore. And so they're all louder. They have Stradivari, Amati, Guarneri, they have never heard their violins the way that we hear them today. And so maybe there's a completely different life 400 years from now for the guitars
Oh.
you're making, you know, because
Well,
somehow technology changes, string technology changes something, and they get a different voice.
no, I agree, and I think that's where, to me, I've always said one of the most key elements of the guitar is the final element after you finish making it. It's the player.
Yeah.
What they do with it is going to dictate what it gets used for. It's going to influence again if we're aspiring to be great builders, we're going to listen to the players and what they need. Now, whether it's a small group or it literally changes the design of the guitar, that's to say, again, to bring it back to Linda and her wonderful Picasso guitar. That's what Pat wanted, Pat Metheny wanted. How many strings can you put on a guitar for me? And Linda sat there, thought it out, figured it out, and then said, okay, this is what I have for you. Gives it to him, and he goes, that's what I wanted. So that instrument was perfect in its construction. Now, how many people need the Picasso? How many people can play the Picasso? That's a different concept and concern. But, there's fundamental things. You as a guitar player, myself as a guitar player, one of the things I used when I was building, when I first, the involvement of the Mirabella guitars, I'd take them to gigs to the guys and let them try them out. And if one guy said, oh, Chris, I don't like the roll in the neck, but 7 other guys didn't say a thing, then I wasn't overly concerned about I liked where the roll was. But if 6 of the guys said, Chris, the bridge is a little bulky. Now I'm feeling this on my hand. If that wasn't there, that'd be better. Well, then all the bridges got more shaped, or the binding edge, the edge on the arm, making the roll. Oh, I feel it's a little sharp. I know it's only a 3-inch body, but boy, I'm aware of that, man. Is there anything we could, and that becomes the standard of all the guitars. So you may have the things that change the guitar for the piece for one player, but then if you're willing to listen to all the players, you have the stuff that changes the guitars. Here we are 30 years later. So you look at that guitar 25 years ago and you go, wow, cool guitar. And you see the similarities of the guitar today, but you see all the little details that all the players said to you, Chris, do this, do this, do this, that make the guitar today what it is now.
Yeah. Fantastic. Chris, thank you for, I think we made a second episode. We've been talking for another hour.
Listen, it's been a pleasure, and it's the thing, again, since I was a little kid, it's been that one thing that's been wonderful, and I was never at a loss of words or never felt unconfident when speaking about guitars. And I'll tell you, you take me out of this element, I go with my wife to a party or something, I'm the quiet guy in the corner. Thankful to be there, looking at everybody, having a great time, but I'm not saying much. With this, I could talk all day.
That's great.
For sure.
My wife's got an uncle like that every time we see him, the daughters afterwards ask me, so, did he tell you about his car? I'm like, yeah. Because he's got he's got one topic that he
yeah.
He's got a Stingray. Yeah. He's got an old Stingray that he'll talk about all day long, and otherwise he's got not much else to say.
Listen, and that's what puts a smile on his face.
That's right.
That's it, And for us, thankfully, it's the guitars, the music, and again, it's such a large scope. There's so much wonderful music. There's so many wonderful instruments. There's just a ton to appreciate.
Yeah, it's wonderful. Well, one last time, thank you for being on Life with Strings Attached, Chris. I look forward to the next time seeing you and your wonderful guitars in person. Thanks for being on the show.
Thanks so much, Jamie. Enjoy yourself, enjoy the family, and thank you again for having me on.
Thank you. Ciao for now.
You've been listening to Life with Strings Attached. If today's conversation meant something to you, consider passing it on. These stories find their place through the people who share them. A new episode comes out every Friday, right here, wherever you're listening. I'm Jamie Gale, and thanks for listening to Life with Strings Attached.